Okay. All right. That means you're live. Okay. Thank you, Oscar, for helping us out with that. So if you're already on this YouTube channel, we've started a couple of minutes earlier. So we'll give it a couple of minutes for people to join. So welcome to the Chapters All Day, the Belgium chapter. So we're actually the first chapter kicking this off, the Chapters All Day. We're privileged and happy to join that. And thanks for the organizers for setting this up. I think it's a great initiative. So so we're the Belgium chapter. Obviously, we're in Europe. And we're one of the first chapters to start this off. I'll also already let me explain to you that as part of this first hour, so we're 1300 hours UTC, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon local time here. So we'll be doing 2 talks. So I will start with a half-hour talk on OWASP SAM. Actually, we've created a second version this year, and so I'll discuss about that. I'll also demonstrate how it works. And then we also have Victor Lepochat, who's a PhD software architecture student at the University of Leuven. And he'll be sharing us some interesting information about a takedown of a botnet, of the Avalanche botnets. So probably around, I would say, 1:30 UTC, Victor will take that particular slot. So we'll give it a couple of more minutes so that we're all aligned on the hour. So 2 or 3 minutes. So, and as with previous sessions, feel free to ask your questions in the chat window. So there's live comments. So we have a couple of people who are monitoring that and who will be sharing those questions with both Victor and myself during the talk. So if you feel free to already put your questions in the chat window. After each talk, both Victor and myself, we saved about like 5 minutes for Q&A. So around 1:25, we'll probably have a 5-minute Q&A, and then Victor will do the second talk. So if you're just joining, you're joining the Belgium chapter here live in Belgium. And so I'll be starting with the first talk around OWASP SAM version 2. And then in 30 minutes, Victor will be taking this or doing the second talk. He's from the University of Leuven, and he'll do the second talk. So that brings us to the first talk with Belgium, the Belgium chapter. So I'll be explaining about 25 minutes about OWASP SAM, OWASP SAM Software Assurance Maturity Model. And I'll talk about how we can use this to create your dynamic software security journey. So couple of small words around myself. So I've started and I'm co-started and I'm CEO of a company called Torion here in Belgium. But besides that, I've been involved with OWASP for quite some time. I started the Belgium chapter around 2005. And I've been quite involved with the OWASP as an organization. And I'm also now, together with Bart de Win, project co-leader of the OWASP SAM project. Obviously the subject of this particular talk. Now, what is SAM? So SAM stands for Software Assurance Maturity Model, and actually it's the goal, the objective of our project is to be the maturity model for all organizations, like small or big, to provide a framework to effectively and measurably analyze and improve your software security lifecycle. So it's something you would add onto your regular software development lifecycle, and you add or you build in security activities as part of your development activities. In the end, obviously, to create more secure software. And SAM provides I would say, the framework for that. We're one of the flagship projects of OWASP already for quite some time. Now, Why do we need such a thing? Why do we need a framework? Well, when we think about software and we think about how software is being created, typically you'll come across a couple of typical phases of creating and deploying software. First, you'll have some design activity. It can be that you're creating a new feature for an existing piece of software, or you're completely designing or redesigning a full application. Some building of code or creation of code or pulling together of libraries and code will be done. Hopefully this all gets tested, and then the majority of our software runs or is deployed in a production environment or is operated in a production environment. Now, in each of these phases, security issues can be introduced. You can have configuration issues, you can have coding bugs, you can have design flaws. And so for each of these security issues, there's a place in the development lifecycle that you typically add or perform security activities. And where traditionally, or I would say for less mature organizations, security is being added to software in a more reactive way, meaning you're doing testing, or you're putting in front of it a web application firewall, a WAF, or you're doing some vulnerability scanning. The whole idea of what we call the shift left, I would say, paradigm is to build in security controls like security requirements, threat modeling as part of design, or coding guidelines, performing static code reviewing as building code, to perform security testing or to track or to find secure coding bugs. Those are the more proactive security controls. Now, these are a couple of examples of how you'd add or build in security activities as in your way of developing. And this is really independent if you're doing this in I would say, the more traditional waterfall model or the more agile or even like in a DevOps approach. You still have security activities that can and should embed in your way of working. And that's where SAM comes into the place. SAM provides a description of all the activities you can and you should introduce as part of your development lifecycle, and then I would say converting your development lifecycle in a secure development lifecycle, in a SDL. And so SAM is really the OWASP framework to set up and improve a secure development lifecycle. Now, why have we, and I would say when I say we, Pravir created the project already more than 10 years ago, and then I would say a full project team took that over. Why is SAM a maturity model? That's really because adding security activities to your development lifecycle is really about changing the way you develop and deploy and operate code. And that is something that you should do in iterative small steps. You will not change everything overnight. So having a maturity model that provides an iterative way to add security activities to your development lifecycle is one of the things we wanted to have with SAM. It also should be based on how on your risk profile. So you should not immediately do everything. So maybe it's good enough to do a couple of basic security activities for, I would say, less risky software, where if you have high risk software, I would say just for maybe doing financial transactions or for remotely controlling very critical systems, then you should probably add more controls and assurance into your software. So you need to have something that you can leverage the different risk levels in these activities. And also, SAM itself provides a lot of detail also for non-security people to explain what it is you should be doing. And most and for all, what SAM provides is a measurable way to measure the maturity of these security activities. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because once you can measure these security activities, you can also start to manage them. And so SAM provides you with a tool with the levers to manage your security activities as part of your development lifecycle. And that's really where SAM shines, and SAM is very useful. So where can you find SAM? And I'll show you SAM later on. I'll have a small demo. SAM is available online. It's owaspsam.org. And the whole model is explained there. You can also find typical guidance on how to apply SAM. There's also a couple of links to the community and so on, and I'll explain and I will demonstrate and show the website later on. So, and everything we do is as a project team, we've created dynamically the content on GitHub, and it automatically from GitHub, the content is being published to the OWASP-SAM.org website. And I'll give you a little bit of an insight of how that works also later on. So enough talking about the definition. Really, what is SAM really about? Now, in this slide, you see the core structure of SAM, and SAM is built around 5 pillars or 5 what we call business functions, and they're organized, and security practices and activities are organized around how do we set up an SDL. That's the governance. Also, it's around designing activities. And this is design business function. How do we implement code? How do we create code? And what kind of security activities do we add to that? And also, how do we verify that we've done a good job? And how do we manage software in an operations environment? So these are the 5 business functions. Each of these 5 business functions have 3 security practices. For instance, governance has strategy and metrics. How do you create and set up an SDL? How do you measure and improve that you're doing a good job? It's also about policy and compliance. How do we take into account compliance standards and so on? And it's also about educating people involved and providing guidance and setting up an organization and a culture around that. And so that's an example of how security practices are organized in 3 security practices per business function and 2 activities per security practice. And that's really the structure for each of the 5 business functions. So it would take us too far, and we don't have enough time to completely explain the whole structure. But from time to time, we also provide some training to explain everything. But every aspect here is described and explained in OWASP-SAM. And in OWASP-SAM, what you'll find is how we, for each of these security activities, what the objective is, what kind of activity it is, but the description, how you measure that, the questions around that, and how do you measure that you're doing a good job. And in the previous version, you also already have some like success metrics, costs, involved staff, related levels, and so on. And we're also integrating that in the latest SAM version 2 as well. So how do they have already talked a little bit about maturity and activities. How does this all fit together? So let me take one specific security practice as an example. So I'm taking security requirements testing. So if I'm showing that is the requirements testing, is the middle one of verification. So in this requirements testing, there's actually 2 activities. There's control verification as a stream A, and we call that a stream. And there is misuse and abuse testing as a stream B. And the way it's really being set up at this security practice is the control verification is in a positive way, checking for the existing and the proper working of security controls, whereas the B stream in this case, and that's still true for all the security practices, but the B stream here is in a way looking for things that particularly can go wrong. It's like fuss testing, abuse testing, and so on. So, and in each of those 2 streams, there is activities being described in the rows, and these activities are actually organized around levels of maturity. We start with level 0. If you're not doing anything, you're a level 0 for your requirements testing. If you're doing some activities that are related to level 1, you're opportunistically finding basic vulnerabilities or security issues. In this case, for requirements testing, that's a level 1 maturity. You're doing the basic aspects. You're testing for standard control, performing security fuzzing testing. And then when you do that, when you've added that kind of capability to your team and to your tool sets, you can think of increasing your maturity to, for instance, level 2. And level 2 will be performing these kind of security activities in a more automated way and more tuned towards your application. So for a stream A, that would mean deriving test cases specifically from your security requirements in a positive stream, and creating or testing abuse cases or business logic flows for your software in the B stream. So if you've added that over time and you've become good at that, and you really think it's necessary to go to a level 3, because that's not always, I would say, necessary, you can go for a level 3 maturity. And a level 3 maturity, most of the cases, is about becoming better at this, learning from these activities and providing feedback loops into your SDL. And in this case, it's performing regression testing with security unit tests for the A stream, and doing denial of service or security stress testing in the B stream. And so that's the increased maturity level. And so for each of the security practices, I've now explained requirements testing, but each of these 15 security practices in sum is organized around 2 streams with, in essence, 6 activities, 3 activities per stream, with an increasing level of maturity from 0, 1, 2, or 3. That's how this works. Now, once we have that, the beauty and the interesting part of SAM is that you can also measure this. And there is, and in each of the SAM descriptions, there's a couple of related questions for each of these activities. And this is, in this slide, I'm showing you the questions that are related to strategy and metrics. So remember, strategy and metrics is one of the security activities as part of governance. In this case, it's the create and promote stream as part of governance. And here you have a couple of questions that typically measure, are you performing a level 1 activity of strategy and metrics? Do you have you identified what kind of risks your application is facing? Do you have a plan? Is it regularly reviewed? Those are level 1, 2, and 3 activities that we're asking for. And so in white, and I would say the bold questions are the main questions that are really checking if you're doing this, whereas the sentences, what we call the quality criteria underneath each of the questions, are really the checks you should be doing as, okay, am I doing a good enough job to really, I would say, answer in a way that I can say, I'm not only doing this, but I'm doing this in a proper way. Now, what I'm showing you here is what we call the SAM2 toolbox. You can download this. This is a spreadsheet that you can use and fill in yourself. And I'm going to demonstrate you how that works. First of all, typically what comes out of SAM is typically you're doing like a first basic assessment of where you are, and you're setting your goals. That's what you see here on the left side. That is between an as-is and a to-be, or before and an after. But what you can also do is create what we will call your SAM roadmap. You start at a certain point, at 0, and you gradually, in phases, add or introduce extra security activities for each of the security practices. And so you're increasing the maturity of each of the security practices between 0, basically doing nothing, and to a target value of 1, 2, or 3, based actually on your, I would say, target risk level. So that's how SAM works in a nutshell. Let me maybe show you how that works with a demonstration. So I'll share my screen, and what I'll share is I'll first share OWASP SAM itself. So what you're seeing here is the website. So if you go to owaspsam.org, you'll see the website. It explains a little bit what SAM is, what it's for, and so the structure and so on. That's the about SAM. It also provides guidance about, okay, how do we start? Typically, you should also see that on the home screen. Getting started explains typically how you would perform a SAM assessment, and it explains in tabs the preparation phases, assess phases, setting your target, and so on. So this is all being explained. It's also explaining about how you assess yourself against SAM, and there's some tools for that, and I'll show you the downloaded tool, but there's also online assessment tools. And also there's help from the community really I would say, assist you if you have any questions. So we have a Slack community and OWASP Slack. There's Google groups. So whenever you're stuck, actually we can help you. And also there's an initiative called benchmarking where you can compare yourself if you've done your SAM assessment with others. We're actually setting that up, and Brian Glass, who's one of I would say, core team members, is building up the first, I would say, core, I would say, baseline of some data, so that if you have enough data, you can start comparing yourself with others. And then we've also some extra information, for instance, on the user Dale. I'll pitch that at the end of this presentation. But the meat, I would say, the most important aspect is the model itself. That part, the model itself is, you can find it obviously under the tab, the model. Here you'll find the 5 business functions which I've explained earlier on around governance, design, implementation, verification, operations. And let me, for instance, explain you, for instance, one of them, one security stream or security practices, which is called threat assessment. So you have here, as part of design, threat assessment. It explains what threat assessment really is for, what the objective is, why you want to do this. And you have here also the 3 maturity levels and the 2 streams, in particular for threat assessment. And there is a stream A, which is about putting your application in risk profiles, like a low, medium, high, and also about performing threat modeling. And threat modeling here, and I'll, for instance, show you how threat modeling would work. Threat modeling is a security activity as part of threat assessment, which you can do or should be doing as part of your design activities to identify architectural design flaws. And there's a maturity 1, I would say, explanation. There's a question, how you're doing that, what the quality criteria are. That's maturity 1. If you're doing that, you can become better. Maturity 2, and then you can reach for a maturity level 3. So each of the elements of SAM is explained in that way, and you can jump around and discover the whole SAM model that way online. So that is how you can discover and learn about the model itself. Now, I've also talked about the assessment part. Now, in the assessment part, there is a download link to a toolbox. So you can actually, it points to our GitHub where you can download a toolbox. Now, I've already downloaded that. It's available here. So what you have here is the downloaded spreadsheet. It has a couple of tabs at the bottom, and you typically start with the interview part. And so based on the scope you think you should be doing this, and typically I would recommend start this within your own development team. You can start adding or measuring what you're doing. And if, for instance, if we would take one thing, for instance, education and guidance is an interesting one to start with. Typically, a level 1 activities is performing or doing basic training for your team. And so the question is, do you require employees or staff to do, I would say, SDL training? Let's say some of them have that. Is it customized in a level 2 for individual roles, such as testers or security champions? Well, some of the training. Do you have kind of like a learning management system or something to track what you've been doing, and maybe a certification process? That's a level 3 maturity level. No, we don't do that. And so, those are your basic questions. But what you see here at the right is the basic scoring. It means that for this security practice, by responding to this, we already know that we're at a maturity level 0.25. And so if you're adding also the organization and culture, maybe you have some champions for some teams, and there is a software security center for that part, but we're not really doing the 3rd level activity. So it would mean that we have a maturity level of 0.6 for education and guidance. You can also start creating a roadmap for that. This is the first phase. Let's say that, for instance, in the next phase, we want at least half of the people to be trained. And by the end of our program, all the teams, all of them should have training. And that we're introducing maybe like for most of the trainings, like tailored and customized training, and that we also start introducing a learning management system. So, and in that way, you're creating actually a roadmap, which in the end, you can also see in your roadmap chart. So if you then here, this is the example of what we've just been doing. So we've created our own roadmap for education and guidance in a couple of iterations. So that typically is how it might work and how SUM is being used. So I've done it very fast here. We only have that much time, but I wanted to show you how SUM works, where you can find it, how you can download the toolbox, and how you can perform a self-assessment. And the typical quick start is you prepare and you scope what your team, your proper team or a couple of teams, you do your assessment, you set your target, you define your planning, and in iterations, you implement it, you roll it out, a couple of activities, and then you do that for your next iteration. So in phases, you'll be introducing, adding activities to your development lifecycle. So that's how SUM works. That's how you can use SUM. A little bit about the project itself. So everything what we do and everything we create it lives on GitHub. So underneath we have YAML files that describe the whole model, so that if you would be building your own tools based on SUM, you can also reuse our say GitHub artifacts to create your own. But as we've been building and I would say creating SUM version 2 in a collaborative way, we needed our own CI/CD pipeline to push, I would say, the new version towards our website. So every time we change something, it's being checked, we generate Markdown, we push and we build that to a test environment so that we can check and verify that everything works, and then it's being deployed to our GitHub-based, Hugo-based actually, on GitHub Pages website. So it's dynamically being generated, and whenever something changes in our GitHub repository in terms of the model, it's being pushed again towards the live environment or our acceptance environment if you first want to test that. So that's how we create it. In terms of roadmap, so we've pushed and we released version 2 at the beginning of this year, and throughout this year, we're going to iteratively perform, I would say, improvements. So if you have particular questions or you want to see something different, that's going to be added in next versions. We're actually also adding agile guidance, DevOps guidance. We're doing roadshows, trainings. We're starting the benchmark project, and there all this kind of information. If you want to know more, you can or should probably join our Slack channel, or also look at what we're doing and then we're explaining this in our upcoming SUM user day. I think if there's one thing you should probably be doing is, if you're concerned about software security, and probably if you're watching this, I think you are, try it out. Try out SUM. It's open source. You can use it. You can adapt it to your own way of development. In that way, you can tweak it if that's necessary. But the proof is in the eating of the pudding. So try it out yourself, and also provide us with feedback. What did work? What did not work? Actually, talking about feedback, the best way to provide feedback or to share what you've done already with SUM is to join us in the upcoming OWASP SUM user day, which is in 10 days, actually. So it's on Tuesday, June 16th. We'll start around the same time frame as now. So we start around 12 UTC, and we'll have a full program of all kinds of talks around SUM, a couple of roundtables, a couple of workshops on how to use SUM, and people also will be sharing their experiences. So you're more than welcome to join us there. It's also, as with a lot of the OWASP events, completely free. We just ask you to register on Eventbrite so that we can have a little bit of an idea how much people will be joining us there. But at this stage, we are already way beyond 100 registrations, so it will be quite interesting. If you have any questions, feedback, input, join us on the Project SUM Slack channel. If you want to join OWASP Slack workspace, you haven't done so, the invitation link is at the bottom. Also, if you have any improvement suggestions, create an issue on our GitHub, or even better, create your own personal pull request with the improvement. We'll look at it and we'll integrate it with the new SUM versions in the near future. If you want to keep updated and you want to learn the latest tips, tricks, and news, I would highly recommend you, I would say, subscribe to our MailChimp-based newsletter. Spam is low. We don't spam you. We'll only be using you to provide you with updates on what we're doing with SAM itself. Now, I'm explaining how SAM works here, but I'm not doing this alone. Together with Bart, who is a co-project leader, incidentally also based out of Belgium, there's a whole lot of people that are working on SAM. I'm listing a couple of these. So here, this is a list of people that are what we call on the core team, but there's a lot of other people outside of this team that have also contributed and are actively engaged in the OWASP SAM project. And I welcome you to also do that. I'd also like to thank our sponsors who make this possible. I would say we donate our time for free, but we're hiring technical editors, we're hiring layout and design help. We're actually organizing on-site workshops where we fly in people, so we always can use some donations from sponsors. And if you want to do that, and if you want to support OWASP SAM, you can do that by donating your time, donating your feedback, or becoming a sponsor, because software powers the world. And if it's not secure, it would really become, and it's a problem for us as a society and as a whole. So with that, I've explained what OWASP SAM is about, and we are ready to take questions. So we have a couple of minutes to have questions. So Oscar, do we have questions from the audience so far?
Yeah, thank you very much, Seba. It's
Yes.
a very nice presentation. And maybe we have time to have a, yes, you have a question here. And this is, when we assess with OWASP SAM, one of the difficult process is to define the assessment scope. Is there any good way?
Yes. Well, there's more than one good way. Actually, it's so obviously it depends on the kind of organization that I would say you're engaging in or what you're part of. I would recommend, certainly if it's the first time, is that you first do this for one development team.
Sorry, I'm talking a little bit.
Oscar, maybe best to mute yourself. Yes, thank you. So start small, start with one dev team, figure out how it works. And then really the scope, it really depends. If you have different teams working on your same kind of software, it would make sense to enlarge your scope and do it for them. If you have different teams working in different kind of development processes, like one is more agile, the other is more DevOps, it might make sense to have different SAM assessments. But I would say as a target SAM level, target score, I would really recommend to aim for a similar target based on the risk level of the software the team is working on. So if you have team A, B, and C, if you team A and C working on high risk software, they should aim for the same kind of SAM level as maybe, for instance, team B. If they're only working on low level internal applications, maybe a lower level, a lower target level would be more appropriate. So I hope that responds to your particular question. If not, if you have any more questions on that, feel free to join us on our Slack channel and ask a question there.
You have another question. This is from Lucian.
Hi, Lucian.
This is there a mapping between OpenSAM and ASVS?
Okay. Hi, Lucian. Lucian's actually joining us in the SAM User Day in a couple of weeks. So first of all, I see you referring to SAM as OpenSAM. OpenSAM is the first version. We are now talking about OWASP SAM, and we have started with some mapping between OWASP SAM and ASVS, but it's not complete yet. So some of the activities of ASVS map quite well into SAM. Especially the verification and the requirements part. So there is some basic mapping done, but we haven't published it yet. So that would be one of the improvements that we can do in the near months.
Yeah, there's no more questions. Really, thank you, Seba, for your presentation. It's really, really good. And really, thank you. I know the people will enjoy a lot as I do.
Okay, my pleasure, and thanks for organizing this. And so then I understand we have our next talk of OWASP Belgium. So that's Victor Lepochat. So Victor, he works with the University of Leuven, actually also probably together with Lieven de Smet. Lieven de Smet is one of our co-organizers within the Belgium chapter, and Victor is doing his PhD on software security. With that, Victor, I'll give the word to you to explain what you'll be presenting to us. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to present to you today our practical approach for taking down Avalanche botnets under real-world constraints. So we'll be talking about malware, how to take it down, and how to make sure that you get the right ones without taking down anything else. This is a research project that we developed at our Distinct Research Group at KU Leuven, together with the LIC team at Université Grenoble-Alpes. And I'll structure my presentation around the 3 parts of the title, and I'll start off by explaining what this Avalanche thing is that I'll be talking about. And don't worry, I won't be talking a lot about snow. Instead, Avalanche was the world's largest and most sophisticated cybercriminal syndicate law enforcement had ever encountered. And what Avalanche did, in a nutshell, was operate an advanced infrastructure that supported the command and control communication for over 20 malware families. And they did this through a layered network of proxy servers, which obfuscated the communication, for example, for law enforcement or for investigators. To give a bit of history, Avalanche was first seen at the end of 2008, and by the end of the following year, they were already responsible for 2/3 of the phishing attacks that were being seen at the time. So they were quite an active group, and throughout the following 8 years, they did quite a lot of damage, infecting over 2 million clients worldwide. So in 2012, German law enforcement started an investigation into the operations of Avalanche. And after 4 years, on the 30th of November 2016, they could conclude with a successful takedown of the botnet. They did 5 arrests, they seized or took offline quite a number of servers, and they targeted the way in which the clients and servers communicated, which will be the focus of the research and the presentation today. In the following years, they did yearly cleanup iterations to ensure that the botnet could not revive. And in 2019, our research team actually participated in this iteration, contributing with the research that I'll be explaining today. So as part of this takedown, law enforcement had to target the infrastructure and the way in which the client and the server communicate with each other. And this was supported by something called a domain generation algorithm. And this supported the communication by generating the domain names that the client would try to use in order to get in touch with the server. So the way this works is the client and the server have the same algorithm, the same code, which takes usually the time of day as input. And then every day, the client will generate maybe 100, maybe 1,000 domain names and try them all one by one. And at some point, it will usually reach the server, where on that side, the botnet owner has registered theoretically only one of those domains in order to allow the client to get in touch and therefore receive new commands, for example, for new DDoS attacks. So these algorithms are built into both the client and the server, and a lot of research focused on detecting these algorithms and malware that contains them by looking at the appearance of these domains, because as these are automatically generated, they often look quite random. If you look at the example on the slide here, it doesn't look like a domain name that a human would buy. So it seems relatively easy to discern these domains and, for example, know that there's an infected machine on your network if you see these kinds of domains in your traffic logs. However, we found in our research and in our data set of domains that there are certain malware families that generate domains that are much less random. This is because, for example, they use words from a dictionary, or they just generate short domains which happen to collide with irregular words or even abbreviations. And it's those kinds of domains that make the task of taking down these domains quite hard for law enforcement, because there's a risk of collisions, because these kinds of domains could be interesting to human actors, to benign parties. And that's the challenge that law enforcement had to solve. So they had to classify the domains that would be used in the Avalanche botnet. And they did this proactively. So they were able to reverse engineer these algorithms that are being used by the malwares in Avalanche and actually input the timestamps after the takedown in order to understand which domains the infected clients would be trying to contact throughout time. And then if they are able to prohibit botnet owners from using these domains to get back into touch with the clients, at least the clients could not do any damage anymore. They would still be infected with the malware, but they would not be able to receive any commands. The thing is that the vast majority of the domains that would be tried by the clients were unregistered at the time of the takedown. And there it was relatively easy for law enforcement to take the right action. They just had to get into contact with the registries to block any registration of these domains at a TLD level. However, there was a small part which was already registered at the time of the takedown. And there, law enforcement had to perform a classification task. They had to either determine that the domain was benign, so it was just registered by a human actor just for benign purposes, in which case they would take no action at all, or the domains had been registered with a malicious purpose by the botnet owners as a sort of pre-registration to already prepare domains that would be able to be used once the clients would start contacting these domains. And those domains specifically would have to be seized by law enforcement through a court order, so quite an involved procedure. And they would then have to be synced to the law enforcement infrastructure to again make sure that clients would not get any commands from the botnet owners. And we ourselves participated in improving this task of classifying the registered DGA domains. And we set out to design a more automated approach to this task, because in the previous iterations in 2017 and 2018, law enforcement had to invest quite a lot of manual effort into this classification. And of course, any manual effort does not scale well and is prone to human error. Now, talking about this error, we ourselves would also not be able to make a lot of errors. We would have to make quite accurate decisions. Because if we were to take down a benign domain, then we would unjustifiably interrupt the service of that domain. And if we didn't take down a malicious domain, then we again leave an opening to the botnet owner to register that domain, get back into contact with the clients, and, for example, push an update that changes the domain generation algorithm. And in this way, the botnet can respawn and the law enforcement efforts are made useless. And given that we were working on a real-world case, the Avalanche botnet, we also had access to real-world ground truth. So we had the results from the manual efforts that law enforcement did. So we were able to create an approach that did not have to work with synthetic datasets, which may not be as representative of the kinds of domains that we would be seeing in our dataset. The flip side is that our ground truth is therefore quite limited. It's only those domains that had been covered in the previous iterations. So there might be certain biases that we have to account for when we are developing our approach. Moving on to the second part of the title, where we highlighted the constraints that we face. Again, because of this real-world use case, we identified three major constraints that affect the indicators of maliciousness that we can use when we're developing our approach. The first one is that the patterns that we see in these domains tend to be much more individual. And what I mean with that is that as opposed to previous research, previous approaches, previous ways of classifying benign and malicious domains, we do not see the kinds of bulk behavior that they rely on. For example, studies saw that spammers tend to register domains in bulk, which means that they register domains in a quite short time span with the same registrar, with the same whois details, such as the registrant. Or alternatively, that again, these lexical patterns, this randomness that we would see in the domains, would be much more of a concentrated way, a concentrated pattern, which can then be detected. Meanwhile, in our data set, we found that this is not the case, and we can understand why this is the case. The botnet owner only needs one domain a day to be able to function properly, so they do not have this need to register a lot of domains with similar properties because it doesn't have to be as automated. Secondly, our analysis has to be proactive. Recall, we are generating these domains before the malware would actually try to use these. So we cannot detect any ongoing malicious activity. No one will be using these domains yet. So again, we have the challenge that we have to capture malicious intent in the registration without being able to rely on malicious activity. And finally, we don't want to make any active connections to these domains, even though there are interesting data sets to collect there, for example, web content. Again, we want to remain stealthy. We don't want to alert any of these attackers that we're investigating these domains. Again, no one else will be contacting these domains at the time of the takedown. So a very sophisticated attacker could detect these kinds of incoming traffic and shift their strategies, again, changing the algorithm maybe, and therefore, again, thwarting the takedown efforts. So now we can move on to the approach that we developed, and we really wanted to develop a practical approach that law enforcement would be able to deploy in the real world, and that would provide sufficient insights into how the malware operates in order to continue using these kinds of tactics for future takedowns. We started off by enriching our set of domains, with comprehensive feature sets, so additional data, of course, within those constraints that we face. So we would, for example, not be able to use any active web content. And we wanted to replicate the state as of the takedown. So when we were developing our approach, we made sure to use historical data, which means that we have a much more accurate view of what law enforcement would have seen at the time and that of what law enforcement would see in future takedowns. Of course, we can only do this if it's possible. So, for example, we don't have any historical search results to train and test our approach on. Those feature sets that I talk about, we selected those based on the life cycle of a domain name. So we start off again with, of course, with the choice of a domain name. And in this case, this refers to the domain generation algorithm, which kind of chooses which random domains it will generate. After which the botnet owner will decide to register a specific domain from that set. And then, of course, start off by configuring the DNS records to make sure that the domain can be reached. They would then set up the service. The service is, in this case, the command and control server that the clients would contact. And afterwards, you could see ongoing activity of the server, so actual clients that are trying to contact this domain. In the end, of course, the domain expires at some point, but we do not really consider this stage in our approach because we would be the ones who would be taking down the domain and forcibly make the domain expire. For all of the relevant steps, we then looked for accompanying data set. So for the domain names, we have the lexical composition. For the registration data, we use whois data. For the DNS data, we rely on both active and passive DNS data. For the service setup, we looked at certificate transparency logs because we were interested to see whether the more advanced setup of a TLS on these domains would indicate maybe a more benign service. And finally, we'll also look at the popularity of the domain over time. Again, if a domain has been quite active for quite a while, it's more likely to be benign and a regular site. One issue we did face when we were looking at these data sets is that some domains have missing data. So, for example, in the case of whois, due to the GDPR in Europe, a lot of TLDs do not provide access to quite detailed whois data anymore. And in the case of passive and active DNS, we rely on a third-party provider, and their coverage may not be sufficient to cover all the domains in our dataset. Yet, we still have to classify all the domains, because that's what law enforcement would have to do. They can't have a domain where they say, we don't know what to do with this domain, we don't take action, or we don't take it down, we don't know what to do. That's not a possible option. So we developed an ensemble model, and what this ensemble model does is look at all the combinations of available and unavailable datasets, train a model for each partial combination, and then when we have to classify a domain, we take the model that is most appropriate and we take its output as our final output. And this ensures that we can provide a classification of benignness or maliciousness for all domains while still maintaining the full coverage and the accuracy that we require. Talking about the accuracy and the performance, let's dive into the results that we got when we developed our approach. And I'll talk you through the different stages, the iterative stages that we took in order to come up with our final and best working approach. Because we started off with a very basic approach, where you train on 1 year, so you try to capture the patterns that you see in a data set of a previous year. And then in our case, we test, or you classify the domains of the iteration, the next iteration, where you want to have the outputs, where you want to know whether the domains are benign or malicious. Unfortunately, we saw in our tests that this kind of behavior, this kind of approach would not provide sufficient performance for law enforcement. There would be too many errors that would make sure that we take down benign domains or we don't take down malicious domains. So while we save a lot of effort because everything is automated, we see that we do not get the required performance. And the reason for this is something called concept drift. And what this means is that the concepts or patterns that we see in our data over time change, they drift. For example, there might be other botnet owners or botnet masters who are trying to take over the Avalanche botnet by also registering these domains. Or maybe the original botnet owners change the way in which they register domains over time because maybe their favorite registrar went out of business or has become more strict in controlling the domains that are being registered at that registrar. So we need a way to capture these patterns, these new concepts over time. And that's why we extended our approach with something we call a priori classification. So recall, we are trying to classify a certain set of domains by looking at data from previous years. But we also include a small part of the data that we want to classify, and we already do this kind of effort manually upfront. And what we want to do through this approach is capture some of those novel patterns that we see evolving throughout time, and already integrate them into our automated model. This means that we have to invest a little bit of manual effort, but we see that we gain a little bit of performance, yet not really up to the strict requirements that we have from law enforcement. So that's why we set out to develop a more hybrid approach. We introduce a certain sort of human oracle who complements the decisions that are being made by the automated model. And we assume that this human oracle has more data sets, for example, that are maybe available only at the time of analyzing the domains, or is able to perform more targeted or more domain-sensitive decisions for the domains that are hard to classify. And the way this works is that a posteriori, so after the model has generated its classifications, we ask the model, how confident are you? So the model outputs a score which indicates how confident it is about its decision. And if this does not meet our threshold, then we pass those hard to classify domains on to the human analyst, who will then make the final and, as we assume, accurate decision. We have to invest a little bit more manual effort, but we gain a lot of performance. And here we get to the levels of performance where we can confidently say that the vast majority of the domains that we classify get an accurate label. And still, we save a lot of manual effort, as I said. For example, for the 29 iteration, where we contributed this model to the ongoing classification efforts, this could result in a 77% reduction in manual effort. So we have this model, this automated classification model, and we made sure that it was sufficiently interpretable in order to extract further insights into the model and into the things that influence the model, which ultimately indicate how the model decides whether a domain is benign or malicious. And I've listed the most important features for the model, and we see that the time-based features are quite important. And the advantage here is that these are quite hard to evade, because an attacker cannot go back in time and register an old domain. It's impossible to make a domain that you have to register right now and make it seem like it's 2 or 3 years old. So this kind of indicator of maliciousness, because of the recency of the recentness of when this domain was being registered, is a very strong signal that can be very interesting to explore in future takedowns as well. What we also see is that certain data sets are more important than others to the model. For example, WHOIS data is quite important because it captures a lot of this time-based information. And when we think back about the fact that sometimes we have missing data, this means that the availability of certain data sets might affect the performance of our model. However, we also see that there's quite some redundancy. So other data sets also capture, for example, this kind of time-based information, such as the passive DNS dataset or the active DNS dataset. So this means that even if we have missing data, if certain data sources are not available when we want to classify and understand whether a domain name is maliciously registered, we still have other data sources that can provide similar information, so that can provide redundant information, and that can therefore ensure that our model still performs well and can again classify all the domains that we see. So with this, I've covered our whole approach and I've covered all the parts of the title, and I'll recap what we've learned in our study and the kinds of insights that we were able to provide in our case to law enforcement for future takedowns. So we worked on a real-world use case, the Avalanche botnets, and we looked at a specific part where for the domains that are being used in the CNC communication between client and server, for those domains that we want to proactively block, but that had already been registered at the time of the takedown, we want to automate this classification effort in order to reduce the effort that law enforcement has to invest into ensuring that this classification task occurs correctly. Because of the real-world setting, the real-world use case, we got a unique opportunity to work with real ground truth, so make sure that our approach is tested and trained with as robustly as possible, as accurately as possible, and we were able to have real-world impact. This kind of research was actually deployed in the real world and had an effect on the 2019 iterations and the results that were obtained there. However, this real-world setting also imposes certain constraints. So again, we have missing data sources, we can't use other interesting data sources, and we have very strict requirements in terms of performance, which is why we developed a hybrid model. So we do not rely only on the automated model, although we leave it to classify the bulk of domains in order to reduce manual effort. But we also involve a human analyst who will make sure that we get a very high accuracy and who will look at the domains about which the automated model is least sure. We also develop our model in such a way that we can get real insights for future real-world takedowns into how these attackers operate and how we can determine whether the domains had been registered for a malicious purpose, for example, looking at the time-based features. And this ensures that we can increase the effectiveness of future takedowns, which means that we can ultimately ensure that we stay one step ahead of the attackers. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for watching and listening. I've left a few contact details here on the slide, but I'm of course also happy to answer any burning questions right now in the Q&A. I don't know if Oscar will still be joining to cover the questions or not.
Oh, yes.
Hello.
Sorry. For instance, you don't have any questions, but your presentation is really, really nice. Yeah, we must just see Seva also. And wow, and I think what you're doing for your students, you said you are a teacher in Belgium?
I'm still a PhD student myself as well, so mainly doing research into these kind of malicious ecosystems and trying to weed out the bad guys and help out the good guys.
Yeah, and can you tell us how do you do this work? How do you find in this kind of bad guys? In which way do you think that this will be for make better? And in which way you want to think that this kind of research will change with the time?
So we had a very unique opportunity in that we were able to collaborate with law enforcement. So a lot of this kind of research projects, they have very nicely developed approaches. But the problem is that it's quite difficult to deploy these kinds of things in the wild because you need access to certain data sets, you need access to certain people, you need access to certain processes. This kind of taking down of domains, it's like I said, it has to go through a court order. So the investigators have to go to a judge and have some sort of ability to force registrars to take down these domains to make sure that they do not fall into the hands of the bad people. So we were lucky enough to be able to have this kind of interaction with law enforcement to make sure that the approach that we developed had actual real-world impact, going also towards the future. So being able to disseminate our approach and make sure that other agents, other law enforcement agencies can look at what we've done, the way in which we also tested our approach quite extensively and evaluated how it works, and iteratively developed it, looking at what works, what doesn't work, reporting on this, because in that way, law enforcement can really understand, okay, this is the kind of tactics that don't work and that we should not invest time in, and those are the kind of tactics that do work and that we can apply to our problems and our use cases.
Yeah, you have a question for the audience also. It's a Firewing. Wasn't there any possibility to reverse the domain generation algorithm to determine the next domain that will be used?
Yeah, very good question. That's actually what law enforcement did. So they also had people who reversed these algorithms, and that's the way in which they were able to take action proactively. So they basically run these algorithms, but with a fake time input. So let's say all the days in the coming year, and they look at what the reverse engineered algorithm then outputs. And those are the domains that they target in this takedown. So they don't really, of course, at the beginning, they were also looking back at all the domains that were already active at the time. But going forward, they were able to use the outputs of these reverse engineered algorithms to ensure that even if a client, say, in 1 year tries, an infected client in 1 year still tries to reach out to the CNC server, that even those domains would be blocked from any registration and would not be able to be used by the botnet owner to get back in touch with the client.
Yeah, nice. And in which way you think that, Victor, we can provide this kind of things in a judgment? Because sometimes we have problems when we want to try to help to the good people, but sometimes it's very difficult to put this kind of guys inside to the jail because many judge, I don't know what is this in Belgium. This is why I'm asking to you. But in which way you use this kind of things for making a proof for inside to the court?
The way in which we developed our approach and in which we developed our collaboration is that we said we wouldn't make the final call. So in our specific use case, we provided our data to law enforcement, and they were the ones who determined, okay, we'll go forward with this data. Again, for example, relying on this confidence score that we gave. So if we say we are very confident about these domains, then they took the output as is. If we said our model is not as confident, then they would apply additional verification steps to make sure that they would not make any incorrect decisions. So ultimately, it's still up to law enforcement to take these kinds of actions and to make sure that the appropriate action is taken through the appropriate legal measures. That's not something that we really can do. There might be certain efforts also privately to make sure that certain bad domains are being taken down quite quickly. But the most foolproof way is to go through the legal system, because there a judge will ultimately decide, okay, this domain has to be taken down, and nobody can contest that. If you take it privately, it might be faster. There is certainly a delay in going through this whole process with law enforcement. It might be faster, but there may be much more of an opportunity for rebuttal, and then you risk again that botnet owners are able to reverse the decision and get hold of the domain again, and then again propagate the malware and make sure that it continues respawning.
Yeah, really nice. And can I ask you something to you, Seva? And how did the people can enjoy the Belgium chapter? Can you introduce us how they can enjoy to be part of this amazing chapter? You are doing a very good job, and I want to know, and maybe the people want to know also, how do they enjoy to your chapters and your activities also?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, Oscar. So we now run our chapter for nearly 15 years. So we organize, I would say, around 3 to 4 chapter meetings each year, where and also we really appreciate that from time to time we have the University of Leuven hosting some of our chapter meetings, but we also run them at other sites or venues in Belgium. And what's a really good thing and interesting in Belgium is we have quite an active, I would say, security community. So I would say for most of our chapter meetings, we have about 80 to sometimes 100 people in a chapter meeting. And so what we do is we just make sure we have a couple of really good talks. And then people join us. We also make sure that every time then we organize a chapter, there is something not only for the mind but also for the stomach. So we provide pizzas or sandwiches and a drink, and maybe also sometimes afterwards a Belgian beer. That's always good as well. But yeah, so far so good. Unfortunately, due to the Corona and COVID crisis right now, it has been some time. So I'm really happy with the virtual OWASP chapter all day, so that we can do our chapter meetings online.
Yeah, this is a very nice time to spend. And where is which one is the next step? Then the next meeting you will have. Do you have a date already?
We haven't set a date yet in Belgium so far, so I assume maybe we can still do one before the summer holidays, but it would be in June still, but probably we'll have one in September, and then we organize our yearly what we call OWASP Benelux Day, and that is I would say a one-day event we organize together with the chapters from Luxembourg and the Netherlands, and that is always the last Thursday and Friday of November. So this year that would be 26th and 27th of November. So we have a full day of trainings, free trainings, and then we have a full day of talks. And hopefully we can still and we can do that. I would say as a physical meeting, and it will probably be hosted in the Netherlands end of November this year.
Yeah, so really nice. We have for other things, we have on a few more hours. Sorry, and a few more minutes, and maybe something that you can tell to to the people. Feel yourself free. Whatever you want to say, Victor, how the way that you think that the people have to be care, not only the thing that the penalty law, maybe sometimes in the job laws or whatever. Many tips that you can tell to the people that have to be careful about the things that you talk about.
I don't know if I really understand what question you asked.
No. Oscar, am I right in understanding that there's a little bit of a gap between this chapter session and the next one?
Yes, we have a little few minutes more.
So because normally it's New York taking over, no?
Yes, but for a thing that happened, unfortunately, to one of the chapters. So his leader have in the hospital. So we have in a few minutes more. If you want to speak a little bit more, I'm thinking is if Victor can give to the audience many tips than they can see in maybe in the web, maybe or whatever, for to be careful with the cyber attacks. Maybe some things that they can tell you, hey, we're see this and we can to report for anything. I don't know.
I haven't prepared really anything else.
Yes.
I don't know about you, Victor, but I would say we had two sessions of half an hour, and I would suggest that we probably switch over to one of the next, I would say, chapters, or otherwise, I would say round up or wrap up this session, and then people can join one of the upcoming sessions in I would say probably then 50 minutes, because what's the next one? It's then it would be Uruguay at 1500 UTC.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll not be able to fill up the space until Uruguay. So unless you have some particular question on the topic we've covered so far, Oscar, I propose you wrap up this session.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have to the audience waiting for a little bit. In a few minutes more, New York City will be here with all of the chapter from New York. And thank you very much, Seba. Thank you very much, Victor, for everything and for both very good presentations. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, Oscar, and thank you, Victor, also for joining us. And
thank you for providing the opportunity.
Success, and success, Oscar, with the rest of the